Welcome to the Veritas Podcast, the show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church. Hello and welcome. This is part 2 on our discussion of Leo XIII's Libertas. I'd like to continue our discussion on paragraph 6 of Libertas. Rob, can you give us another example of this issue of the will and reason against our sense of the natural law?
Like take, for example, abortion. Okay, we know by virtue of the natural law, you don't kill your own kid. Okay, we know that naturally. But see, the abortion promoters, they'll confuse ladies, and they'll tell them, no, it's not really a kid. It's just a blob of tissue. And maybe they're truly, honestly confused and hadn't really thought about it, maybe, or something. And maybe they go have an abortion, and they really think it's just a blob of tissue. But it's interesting, after they do have that abortion, even though they were kind of confused, a lot of times it sends those ladies off the rails. And we've all heard stories of ladies that had abortion and just completely lost it afterwards. So it's interesting that when they make that wrong choice, even though they may sincerely have thought it was an okay thing to do, after they make that wrong choice, the bad choice affects them. So that's kind of interesting to think about.
Oh, absolutely. I used to be heavily involved in an organization called Rachel's Vineyard, and they exist because of exactly what you're talking about, women who've had abortions, and that natural law creeps back into their conscience and even their intellect as well. And they start realizing to some extent or some level that I've done something, horribly wrong, a major mistake in my life. But at the time, for whatever reason, not only their will, of course, is clouded with whatever needs to be done right then and there. I can't have this baby or this child that's going to ruin, whatever it is in my life, or being pressured. But also their intellect, like you were saying, Rob, they talk themselves into it because everybody around them has kind of brainwashed them subtly and ongoing to this is the good for you to not have this pregnancy, and this is the only good that you have to choose from is to have this abortion. And so to them, that's what's happening, I think, in their life. That's an excellent point.
Right. And then, of course, also in addition to the natural bad reactions, you also have the preternatural level. The devil does. He'll always try to convince you it's okay, But then as soon as you commit the sin, then he's all over you. Oh, you shouldn't have done that. Oh, look what you did. So you're also going to have that level working on these ladies. So if someone out there listening has had an abortion, you don't want to despair. That's the last thing you want to do. You want to repent of that sin. Again, despair is just almost adding another sin on top of the first sin you committed. So you don't want to go there. You want to repent, and if you're Catholic, which you should be, you want to go to confession. And also just think about this. Sometimes we'll think, oh, we've just committed such horrible sins. God could never forgive me. And again, when someone has committed bad sins, the devil's going to be there, and he's going to be throwing it in their face. But think about this. If you ever think that you've done something so bad that God won't forgive you, think about that Jesus already died for that sin. Whatever sin you committed, it was horrendous, and it was horrible, and we're not disputing that. But that bad sin, Jesus died for that sin. Okay, even though we're saying it's really bad, he died for that. Now what does he want? He wants to be able to forgive you. So again, if you're in that position and the devil's throwing it in your face, which he probably will, don't despair. Go to confession so you can have it forgiven.
Real briefly, you mentioned preternatural. Can you explain that to us?
My phone cut off. I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, preternatural. Can you explain that concept?
Yeah, preternatural is the level between the natural and the supernatural. The natural, that's our level. Supernatural, that's the level of God. Between that level, you have what we call the preternatural, and that's the level of the angels, of the demons. There's preternatural gifts that God gave to the first man. So it's the level between the natural and the supernatural.
Yeah, excellent. All right, one last one. This is
probably go off on one more point here. With the situation in the world today, we have a natural desire in our hearts for God. Okay, the world is really confused, but people still, wherever they are, have a natural desire for God. What we see happening a lot today is this natural desire for the supernatural is actually going to the preternatural, which they think
Yep.
is the supernatural because it's above their nature, but it's not the supernatural, it's the preternatural. What's on the preternatural level? The devil. So,
Yep,
but also
absolutely.
the angels are too. So you have this fascination. I know in the 90s there was a real fascination on the angels. You know, it's getting everyone looking to the preternatural level. But also you have the aliens and the demons. All that is also the preternatural level. So we see people who have a desire for God. They have a desire for the supernatural. They're moving in that direction, but they're stuck in the preternatural, and they get completely messed up by following all kinds of strange phenomena. You have the ghost chasers. They need to go one level up to the supernatural, which is what they really want. I just want to make that point also.
No, and that's an excellent point. That's so common nowadays. The ghost shows, like you said, the idea of these possession movies and hauntings. That's almost like there's something innate with the human beings that they do know there's something else, but they don't want to go one step even more than that. So
Or they may not even
one last.
know. A lot of them didn't know. You know, they're just looking for something more. They're searching. And their search ends at the preternatural level instead of the supernatural level.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, probably our last paragraph for today's show, in paragraph 6, the Pope continues, this is Libertas, since, however, both these faculties are imperfect, it is possible, as is often seen, that the reason should propose something which is not really good, but which has the appearance of good, and that the will should choose accordingly. For, as the possibility of error and actual error are defects of the mind and attest its imperfection, so the pursuit of what has false appearance of good, though a proof of our freedom, just as a disease, is a proof of our vitality, implies defect in human liberty.
Okay, so what he's saying here, we've discussed this before, is that, the intellect, as we said, the intellect has to make a judgment of the true to direct the will in its choice, but the intellect is also defective due to the fall of man. So the intellect might judge a falsehood as a true, and if it judges a falsehood as being true, it will misdirect the will in its choice. And it kind of gets back to what we said on abortion, how someone can be fed false knowledge. Okay, they're given just wrong information. It's not really a baby. It's just tissue, and it's not really even a child yet. And if you just have the abortion, it'll be all right. You can go to college or whatever. So it's feeding wrong information into the intellect, and so the intellect then judges. You know what? I think having an abortion is the right thing to do. So the intellect then, what does it do? It misdirects the will and its choice, you see. So that's what he's basically saying there. He's saying that both faculties are imperfect. The will is imperfect and the intellect is imperfect. And remember earlier we mentioned the Cheetos. The will's imperfect. We see that in the person who should only eat 10 Cheetos with his sandwich, but instead he eats the whole bag. See, the intellect tells the will only eat 10 Cheetos, but the will is imperfect. It's not truly subject to the intellect like it should be, so the will just doesn't obey the intellect. It does what it wants to do, and so it eats the whole bag of Cheetos. That's the defect in the will. Defect in the intellect. Intellect is confused, so it takes in false information as being true, and that's the defect in the intellect. And then, of course, it misdirects the will in its choice. That's basically what he's saying here.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, then we'll finish up here. Pope Leo continues, this is still paragraph 6, the will also, simply because of its dependence on the reason, no sooner desires anything contrary thereto than it abuses its freedom of choice and corrupts its very essence. Thus,
right here real quick. It's just what we said. What he's saying here is when the reason does propose something false to the will, and the will chooses that false thing, it corrupts its very essence. Why? Because the will is essentially made for the true good, not for the apparent good and not for the false good. It's made for the true good. So if the reason judges wrong, It misdirects the will in its choice. The will chooses wrong. It corrupts its very essence, just like Leo 13 says here. You can continue on there.
Right. Well, and Rob, that's a good point that you make. The will is leaning on reason like a person leans on a crutch. And so if reason is not right reason, like you've been discussing, if it's defective, then it's impossible for the will to be right and true without a good reason on purpose. Now, the will can almost accidentally be good, right? But it's not formed correctly if the reason itself is defective. So,
exactly right. And now it seems like a real mess, doesn't it? We're talking about this, all this error and the error in the intellect and the wills, misdirecting the will and its choice. It seems like a real mess, but there's actually a solution to this problem, which he'll get to later. But we're kind of laying the foundation right now and explaining how everything, to understand how these things work together. And really, once you do understand this, it allows you to think more clearly. It allows you to judge right on certain things. So it's important to grasp this. And then this is also the difficult part. We're on the foundation right now. We're in a metaphysical area. It's technical. But once we get this, then we get to the practical application and kind of flesh it out and make it more understandable. So you can go on now.
Yeah. Pope Leo continues, his intellect and of his essential goodness, nevertheless, cannot choose evil. Neither can the angels and saints who enjoy the beatific vision. St. Augustine and others urged most admirably against the Pelagians that if the possibility of deflection from good belonged to the essence of perfection of liberty, then God, Jesus Christ, and the angels and saints who have not this power would have no liberty at all, or would have less liberty than man has in his state of pilgrimage and imperfection.
Okay, just real quick. What he's saying here is that some people might make the argument, well, hold on a minute. You're saying that my liberty is only given to me to choose good. You're saying that my liberty is not given to me to choose evil. So I think that's actually you're lessening my liberty. My liberty should be allowed. With my liberty, I should be allowed to choose good and evil. And the fact that you're limiting my liberty to only choosing good, that's limiting my liberty. And so what he's saying here, that's not right. If that was the case, that would mean that Jesus and the angels who can't choose evil have less liberty than man who can choose, when in reality it's just the opposite. They're more free because they're not, entangled in error, and their will is perfectly subject to their intellect, which is enlightened by the truth. That's true freedom, which you'll be getting into. True freedom is doing what we ought to do. It's not having the option to do evil. That's actually a defect in our liberty. That's
right. We've run out of time, but you're absolutely right. This idea, sin enslaves us, and he talks about this actually later on in the same paragraph. And so just what you're saying, this really gets to the point of this first several paragraphs we've been talking about, this idea of liberty and the idea of true liberty and the understanding of true liberty. Most modernists nowadays have no idea what that even means. Rob, when you say, no, you must do a moral good, they immediately think of that as enslavement, and you tell them wrong. Yeah, so that's exactly how it is. Okay, well, I think
everyone listening to, if you want to read the encyclical, read slowly what we've covered to this point, and it should be understandable. And then next week we'll take it even further, and we'll get deeper into this, and then we'll get to the practical aspect, and everything will start making a lot of sense.
So Pope Leo XIII in Libertas, paragraph 6 says, quote, "This subject is often discussed by the angelic doctor in his demonstration that the possibility of sinning is not freedom, but slavery. It will suffice to quote his subtle commentary on the words of our Lord, quote, 'Whosoever committeth sin is the slave of sin.' Everything," he says, "is that which belongs to it naturally. When, therefore, it acts through a power outside itself, it does not act of itself, but through another, that is, as a slave."
Right. Yeah, there's a lot we can say about this. It really gets to the heart of the concept of true liberty or true freedom. What is freedom? Now, a thing acts freely, which he'll say this a little later on in the encyclical. A thing acts freely when it acts according to its nature. Okay? Now, what is man's nature? Man is a rational being. Therefore, man acts freely when his actions are in conformity with his reason. When he acts contrary to reason, he's acting contrary to his very nature and is therefore acting as a slave. That's why St. Thomas quoted Jesus as saying, "He who sins is a slave of sin," because sin is acting contrary to our reason, and in so doing, we're acting as a slave to our lower nature. Now, what do I mean by lower nature? Man has a higher nature, and he has a lower nature. Our higher nature is essentially our reason, okay? And our lower nature is our passions and emotions. Our higher nature is spiritual, like the angels, and our lower nature is carnal, like the animals. So man is kind of midway between the animals and the angels. We actually have the nature of the lower animals and the angels in one being. Okay, we have the reason and will, which is the angelic nature, and we have the lower passions, which is the animal nature in one being, man. Our will, in a sense, it stands between the two natures. It stands between our reason and our passions and emotions. And St. Paul, he speaks often of the battle between the flesh and the spirit in the Bible. He always talks about it in Romans, Ephesians, a number of places, the battle between the flesh and the spirit. That's referring to the battle between our reason, which is spiritual, that's the spirit, and our passions and emotions, which is carnal, that's the flesh. Now, this battle between the flesh and the spirit, that's not supposed to be there. That battle is a result of original sin. If there would have been no original sin, there would be no battle between the flesh and the spirit. The reason is there was a gift known as integrity that God gave to the first man and first woman. Integrity would have been passed down to all other men. Integrity is essentially a gift that kept man's lower nature, his passions and emotions, perfectly subject to his reason with no rebellion at all. Okay? Say you wanna move your arms, somebody throws a ball, you want to catch the ball. Notice how your arm, it moved. It did what you wanted it to do. Okay? It didn't have a mind of its own. It did what you wanted it to do. Well, our passions were kind of the same. We wouldn't get angry unless it was reasonable to get angry, and our reason said we should be angry, and bam, we'll be angry. So everything was in perfect order, and that gift of integrity is what did it. It kept our lower nature perfectly subject to an act of our reason and will with no rebellion at all. And that's how Adam's nature was and Eve's nature was prior to the fall, and that's how our nature would have been as well if we would have received that gift.
Leo continues in Libertas, paragraph 6, quote, "But man is by nature rational. When therefore he acts according to reason, he acts of himself and according to his free will, and this is liberty. Whereas when he sins, he acts in opposition to reason, is moved by another, and is the victim of foreign misapprehensions. Therefore, whosoever committeth sin is the slave of sin." Even the heathen philosophers clearly recognized this truth, especially when they who held that the wise man alone is free, and by the term wise man was meant, as is well known, the man trained to live in accordance with his nature, that is, in justice and in virtue.
Right. See, even the pagan philosophers figured out or realized that a wise man, they called a wise man, is a virtuous man. And a virtuous man is a man who lives according to his nature. And what does it take to live according to our nature? It requires that we subject our lower nature to our reason. Now, when Adam sinned, we mentioned above the gift of integrity. When Adam sinned, God removed the gift of integrity, and his lower nature rebelled against his higher nature. That's the battle between the flesh and the spirit. And it's interesting, we can see the justice of God, kind of get an idea of how the justice of God works when we consider this. Because think about it. Man, a lower being, rose up against God, a higher being, and then what did God do? He removed the gift of original justice, and what happened? Man's lower nature rose up against his higher nature. It makes perfect sense. You see the justice of God there. Man rises up against God, okay? So God removes integrity, and man's lower nature rises up against his higher nature, and now we have this battle between the flesh and the spirit that we all have to struggle against. So basically, true liberty, okay, true liberty exists when one has overcome or has subdued his lower nature by subjecting it to his reason. It's like we said before, true liberty is doing what we ought to do, which is that which is in conformity with our reason, with right reason. It's not doing simply what we want to do, because what we want to do is very often contrary to what we ought to do. So when a person is entangled in their vices, okay, there's an alcoholic, or they're a drug addict, or they're really angry and they're furious all the time and they can't control their anger. When they're entangled in vices, they're slaves to their animal nature, and therefore they're slaves to sin, because sin are actions contrary to right reason. So you see how a person's truly free when they've subjected their lower nature to their higher nature, and that's essentially what true freedom is. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And it sounds kind of like we've refused to use the God-given brakes that God has given us. And so without brakes, kind of like a car, we're just speeding down the road and we're slamming into the sides. And that's kind of what seems like happens in all of our lives now without that true justice.
Yeah. And we'll get into later on, we won't have time this episode, but we're going to get into the things that help us act according to right reason. And there's external things that help us, and there's also internal things that help us act according to right reason. And that's what he's going to discuss a little later on in the encyclical. But
right. And it'd be fair to say that we're talking about concupiscence.
Absolutely. Concupiscence and the irascible passions. You have the concupiscible passions, which are the passions that draw you to something, okay? So it's like the love or the desire. The concupiscible draw you, okay? And you also have the irascible passions. And those are the things that kind of repel you, okay? Like the concupiscible want to draw you, okay? So what do you have to do? You have to resist that by practicing virtue to resist being drawn to that alcohol, if you're an alcoholic, or the drugs. You have to resist that. Irascible is the opposite. Irascible is pushing on you, and you have to push back on it. So that would be like fear. Fear pushes you, and you want to shrink. Well, you have to push up with the virtue of fortitude, okay, against the fear.
Okay, well, this is a good starting point. Let's conclude here. I just want to tell everybody who could be listening that we can be found on veritaspodcast.blogspot.com. That's veritaspodcast.blogspot.com. So I'd appreciate it. And Rob, I appreciate your time.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rob. Good talking to you. Look forward
to
it.
All right, thanks. All right.
Bye.